Hey, good morning, everyone. So today I'm doing something a bit unusual, sitting outside, and I have to address. This made me laugh really hard. I have to address a really funny comment that I noticed on my YouTube channel. So years ago, we are talking about probably over a decade ago. I made a video about the book of Zechariah. Was it Zechariah 12:10? And I proposed a linguistic analysis of, an extremely controversial verse in the book, which has been part of the Judeo-Christian argument over the Messiah and stuff like that. And you can debate with me if I'm right or wrong on the linguistic level, even though I give all the evidence and it's all very solid information, and it's perfectly fine if you disagree. I mean, really, it is. You can disagree with me until you're blue in the face, to your own delight, as long as you bring actual arguments. I've always said this. But my absolute favorite comment there, there were some really interesting discussions. There was this guy who came in with a slew of verses and he had a really honest discussion with me. Absolutely brilliant. And then a few months ago, someone wrote a comment saying that, and this was absolutely the best. This is like my favorite statement ever. That I don't speak Hebrew, I speak Yiddish. Now, besides being absolutely false, this person is trying to use some kind of an ad hominem argument that you can't trust what I'm saying because I speak Yiddish, even though I don't. I really don't. I have to openly admit, there was a period where I was slowly picking up on Yiddish because I was working as a baker in a predominantly ultra-Orthodox Hasidic area in Jerusalem. So I did start picking up some Yiddish from the people living there, but I distinctively, when I speak Hebrew, I speak with a very distinctive Haifa region type of Hebrew. I never learned Yiddish. I learned German. I had to learn some German for my academic training. But the statement itself, besides being false, I mean completely false, the statement itself actually stems from something really much more interesting. So, first of all, the first thing is that my family background is quite interesting. We're actually Sephardic Jews. I mean, even the term Sephardi here is not really accurate, but it's quite close to what we are because my grandfather knew this, and my grandfather used to have Spanish Portuguese prayer books in his library, which he hid because when my family moved to England from basically toward the northern Mediterranean, so there's a really interesting thing. My brother did a genetic study, and we belong to a very specific closed cluster on that line between, basically, you would call it Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, which are considered to be Sephardic Jews, and that area we start moving towards Bulgaria and Romania. Now, in the study itself, we discovered there's about 2% Ashkenazim there. I do know that I had a great grandmother, I think, that was partially Ashkenazi. I think she was like Ashkenazi on her mother's side or something like that. So it's about 2%. So it's really cool because today, if you're close enough, you can actually see a lot of things. And it was really interesting because when we looked at it, we discovered that the amount of pure Ashkenazim was like this tiny, tiny little fragment within everything. And which means it's quite far back. Because it depends, there's a whole thing there. But the haplogroups and everything show a very specific, less studied group because we don't belong to the larger groups of people now. Like, for example, even so the theory is that we're probably Greek-Turkish. My father was near a room about at least someone who served in the Turkish army, but the names, the information, everything, the comparison of practices and so on has shown very dominantly, more Greek-influenced culture. My grandparents were very dark people. My father, when he was healthy, had very severe diabetes, so he turned very gray. But my father was a very dark man. My mother's very white. It's not really that didn't really affect our color tone as a family. But the whole thing of using color tone as well is very wrong, because I've met Yemenites who are lighter colored than me. I've met in Yemenites who used to be some of the darkest Jews there are, except for the Ethiopians, which are black. Um, Absolutely nuts. So and there's this really fun guy on YouTube. I think his name is Tal Ornan. He calls himself the traveling cloud piece, and this is Tal in Israel, stuff like that. He's a Jew from America. His family comes from Iraq. Um, Dark guy, could easily could be my father's cousin. He has the same build as we do, but he's an Iraqi Jew. Notice, by the way, I say Iraqi. I don't say Iraqi, I say Iraqi, because as an Israeli, I have the ability to use sounds which were older in Hebrew. So it's not Iraq, it's Iraq. Okay, there's an and a qa at the end. Uh, Distinctively not Yiddish. And the reason this person said this, and this stems from a lack of knowledge of what Israelis are, the studies show. By the way, there's lots of genetic studies on Israelis. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense out there about who Israelis are. And first of all, 72% of Israelis are considered to be either North African, Eastern, Mizrahi, or mixed. I'm considered to be mixed. My mother is a very specific group of people, but I'm considered to be on that cusp of Mizrahi, kind of. We prefer to use the term Yam Tichoni, because it's the northern part of the Mediterranean, so Yam Tichoni means Mediterranean, and that's what my father used to prefer to call ourselves, Mediterranean Jews, because when you deal with Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, you're more part of the Mediterranean world. You're not really Mizrahi, you're not really North African, really, because North African, really, you're talking about people that were less influenced by the old practices of the land of Israel, what's called Minhag Eretz Israel. These are practices that go back to the Second Temple era sometimes, very specific types of prayer books and so on. And my preferred term is Romanati, which means Roman Jews. These are Jews who lived under the Roman Empire. And a lot of Greek Jews, when there were Jews in the Greek world centuries before, but some Jews arrived in the Greek islands and the mainland of Greece because of the captivity from the Second Temple era. I actually have a friend who, again, is a man from England, darker skin, and his family are clearly people who, he says that they did genetic studies. He's obviously, Mizrahi, very clearly, even though his family did live in Europe for a very long while. As far as I know, I think some of his ancestors did speak Yiddish. I'm not really 100% sure. And but there are people that were Sephardic Jews who end up in Europe as well. I mean, this is a quite well-known established thing. In England, for example, the first synagogue was a Sephardic synagogue. The Ashkenaz synagogue was opened about 60 or 80 years after the Sephardic synagogue, which was the first return of Jews after the expulsion in the 12th century. So why do people think that I speak Yiddish? Well, first of all, they don't know what Yiddish sounds like. Yiddish, the first is different dialects of Yiddish and so on, but Yiddish is basically a Jewish version of German. This is a common thing. There's Jewish Berber, there's Jewish Spanish, which is Ladino, and so on. What's the most important thing to understand here is that this does end up becoming a trope that people use because of the problem with American Jews. Most American Jews are Ashkenazim. 90% are Ashkenazim. 10% live in the East Coast and the West Coast. These are Syrian Jews, Persian Jews. They are very different. They're very, as far as I know, they're very isolated. My brother, who actually lives in the New York area these days, tells me that these Syrian Jews are very, very particular. They're very nice people, but they're very, very particular. And that's the thing. So when you go to America, you go to Europe or America, most of what you meet are Ashkenazim. You go to North Africa, the East, there are almost no Jews there. I mean, the largest Jewish population, I think, in an Arab country these days is, as far as I know, I think is Morocco, because there's been there's a few thousand Jews who've moved back to Morocco. Jews who the families originate from Morocco, and then they moved to Morocco, but I think many of them moved there because the place is much more religious than Israel, something like that. I haven't never really met anyone like this. So don't believe everything you see online. But in this specific case, the statement itself, as silly as it is endemic of a larger problem of understanding what Israeli Jews are versus American Jews, where the largest population, depends how you look at it, I think the largest population really is in Israel. And the second is the United States. The United States, a lot of people are defined as Jews, but they don't really live a Jewish life, or they're Jewish from the father's side, so by Jewish law they're not Jewish, or these are people who converted through the Reformed movement, so there's no necessarily Torah keeping, and therefore, according to Halacha, the conversion itself doesn't really stand. And again, I'm not getting in anyone's way about their conversion. So this is not a comment about them, but it's to define what's the majority where. And if you're talking about Jews in a much more classic sense, the majority are here, and the majority here, as I said, 70% are Sephardic Jews. There have always been Sephardic Jews here, except for a short period of time where basically the Romans made very draconic laws to prevent Jews from living here. This is something that's been researched by Rivka Lisak-Shepak, I think her name is. She's a professor, a doctor of history, and she wrote a series of books about what happened to the Jewish population in the land of Israel. Very, very interesting stuff. And I've actually read, there's 4 books, I think I read 2 of them. The first one is the most fascinating because the Romans really went out of their way to stop Jews from living here. And but there were always Jews here, and when you actually do genetic studies on these people, they're no different than anyone else. There's actually a specific family that lives, it's been here since Roman times. They're actually documented as living from Roman times, and they pretty much look like every other Sephardic Jew. As I said, skin tone doesn't really tell you what a person is. You can actually bump into Ashkenazim who are very dark as well. I knew several people like this. I think, who was it? There was a German Jew I once met in Jerusalem who was a very dark man. And he was German. He was, no doubt about it. He spoke Yiddish and everything, but it's pretty dark because the skin tone doesn't really say anything about anyone. It's like Hispanics in the United States, that you have those who are whiter and those who are darker, and it really depends where they come from. And so, even in the Talmud, I think there's places where they talk about lighter skinned people, darker skinned people, because there's no specific color a person is supposed to come if they live in the Mediterranean world. I mean, if you go further into the deserts and so on, yeah, sure, they get darker. There was once this video someone tried to make what would Jesus look like if he was, who would he really look like? And they tried to make him look like an Arab. But Arabs are a very specific ethno group that come from a very specific area. They're darker than northern Mediterranean, what's called northwestern Mediterranean people. You look at the Syrians, look at the Lebanese. Some of them are dark, some of them are very white. I mean, the Syrians, I've bumped into Syrians and Turks who are very light colored, lighter than I am. So, these types of ad hominem, not accurate arguments are absolutely hysterical to me. They're more funny than offensive, but it is part of the anti-Semitism that people have, the lack of ability to argue to the point, and things like that. So, a few facts about Israelis, but genetic studies through and through. I think Jews are some of the most genetically studied groups in the world, and most studies have shown that Jews from wherever they are genetically linked to one another. Ashkenazim are considered to be Mediterranean people. This has been proven through and through. There's no question about it. Yes, there are some studies that skewed the information because they wanted to come to a very specific result, and these were political ones, and they were actually, I think some of them were even withdrawn. I think there were studies that were published through some place, and they were withdrawn because it was proven that the studies were warped deliberately to come to very specific results. So that's always the problem of scientific studies, because scientific studies, you have to have some kind of certain parameters you work with. It's the same way you use carbon-14. Carbon-14, you have to have some kind of an idea where you go into with the information, and based on that, you make the decision of what the result really is, and it's a very, very problematic way of looking at data. Anyone in the sciences knows what I'm talking about. For example, I'm in the humanities. In the humanities, we present arguments, but at the end of the day, a lot of what we do is theory. We present a possibility, and then we hope maybe someone will find information that will correlate what we're saying, but we follow the information as far as we can go, and we present an idea. But we never claim that anything that we present as say, for example, commentary on a Bible or historical interpretation of an event, we never say these are absolute facts. Historians will do it more, Bible scholars less, and I'm trained as a historian as a Bible scholar. I once had an argument in front of a professor where he said, well, we're no historians, and I said, I actually am. I'm trained as an historian, and therefore I can actually make a very specific comment, and I actually did that. During my master's, I actually made comments sometimes as a historian. I said, look, it's very nice that they made this argument, but historically speaking, this is not correct. So the biggest issue is make sure that you know your information, make sure you know your arguments, make sure you understand how to critically think as much as possible. Obviously, there's limitations to these things. And no, I don't speak Yiddish. I know some German. I don't speak Yiddish. Well, I hope this was interesting. Again, more of a tangent, more of a tantrum, I would say, tangent more. But I think very important information has to be said about who I am and what I am and what we are as Israelis and what Jews are. So, hope this helps. Kol tov.